we take up the session again, and it is my pleasure now to introduce you Professor Balázs Trencsényi. I'm never sure whether I pronounce his name properly.
You will never be sure.
I will never be sure, of course. But I experience the same problem very often. Professor Trencsényi is a renowned specialist for political thought and for nationality problems and for all things related to East Central Europe in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century. He has a broad view of comparative history, particularly Central European comparative history. He's fluent in several Central European languages apart from English, and now I think he has also learned more or less passively. He has also learned Galician, and not only Ukrainian from Galicia, but also Galician from here. And he has a number of publications and edited volumes. I mean, next edited volume, one of the next edited volume will be Historical Regions in Europe, together with Diana Mishkova, our Bulgarian colleague. And he's going to give a talk on nation and state in Eastern European political thought after 1918. So, please.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to all who are still alive and sitting with us from the audience. I think my story will be to a certain extent similar to what José Manuel and the two Stefans were talking about, but I think the perspective and the methodological perspective is to a certain extent different, because I'm working with history of political thought mainly, so I'm not so much into the institutions, not so much into the historical representation, and not so much about the kind of international networks, but the kind of East Central European intellectuals who were basically challenged by the same processes that we have been discussing, and they were trying to come up with some sort of theoretical answer to how to then handle the nationality question, or how to handle the kind of new situation. And what I'm presenting is fitting into a broader project, which was actually a co-authored project. I brought you the first volume, which is already published, of our history of Eastern European political thought, so I will even circulate it. And this part that I'm now talking about is obviously already the second part. So we actually broke up the story with the First World War, like end of the First World War, and somehow this post-war story is the beginning of the, for us, of the 20th century in many ways. Of course, the short 20th century, so I can pass it around. And I think what I'm going to do is give you relatively many short references to individual authors or kind of intellectual networks, but my aim is not to flood you with names you have never heard about. So I mean, the idea is not to kind of present 25 different linguistic contexts. It's rather to show through these examples that what we consider to be from a big distance or from a kind of more textbook perspective as linear development is not very linear, similar to what Stefan was talking about in terms of the shift from nationality and minority. I mean, I see very many ambiguities and very many kind of alternative possible intellectual models beyond the nation-state model, the homogenizing nation-state model that seems to be the kind of textbook story about Eastern Europe. Yes, like if you open a book about Eastern Europe, then what you will get is that in the interwar period there are homogenizing nation states and so on. But I mean, if you look at the intellectual debates, then you see much more complex developments. And I think it's also important to bear in mind that I think some of these alternatives, of course, are completely buried by history. I mean, all these personal autonomy discussions seem to be kind of swept away in the 1930s by the rise of Nazi, basically use of or abuse of the nationality question and so on. But then in many other ways, many of these issues came back. I mean, think about, for example, the handling of the Bosnian pacification after the Bosnian War in Yugoslavia. I mean, actually what the European institutions were trying to impose is some sort of combination of territorial and personal autonomy. So actually many of these issues became very relevant, and some other, even beyond Europe, many of these issues are coming back. So I would say that these are not completely academic questions, what we are now discussing. Now, I will talk mostly about the 1920s, early 20s, but I think it's very important to bear in mind that there is a prehistory to what we are dealing with. Of course, there is a long prehistory of debates about national question were very much there in the mid-19th century already in the Habsburg monarchy. I mean, like even the conceptions of let's say deterritorialization of nationality are very much there in the 1860s. So this is not a new thing. This is not invented after the First World War. If I can be patriotic, then I can mention József Eötvös, one of the most interesting figures in this discussion. But there are lots of others, Fischoff, and like there is a whole liberal trend in the Austrian context who are kind of discussing the same thing. And in a more short-term prehistory, I think what I should mention is that basically in the late 19th century, the last decade of the 19th century and early 20th century, there is a kind of rise of the discourses of autonomy. Not so much in the Habsburg monarchy. In the Habsburg monarchy, there is also a trend like this, but I think the most dramatic and most interesting is in the Russian Empire, obviously. But it's very important to mention that the kind of main intellectual context where these discourses of autonomy are actually emerging is very much to the left. Yes, I mean, like it's, so there is a kind of, let's say, socialist discourse about autonomy. Here, of course, what we heard about yesterday about Bauer's potential neo-Kantian connections might be also relevant. So there is a kind of neo-Kantian koine or neo-Kantian common intellectual reference, which is shared by social democrats as well as liberals in the late 19th century. But also I think it's connected to a certain kind of, if you want, Narodnik and anarchist even heritage about self-governing community as a kind of self-expression of human existence. And this becomes very important at the turn of the century. And it's very interesting that if you compare it to the right, I mean, which is normally nationalistic, but what should be nationalistic, but in these groups which are not majority groups, so I mean, we are not talking about Russians, but we are talking about Latvians or Georgians or other communities. The right wing is, because they are conservative, they are basically still thinking in terms of the imperial framework. Yeah? So it's very hard to imagine any kind of autonomy if you are a conservative in a big imperial. It's different in the Habsburg monarchy where you have a conservative state right tradition going back to the mid-19th century. And it's also true, by the way, for the Ottoman Empire. Yes, there you have also this kind of very similar to Austro-Marxist thinking emerging in the turn of the century, partially from emigre communities as well. So basically you have this kind of autonomy discourse, but it's very much to the left, and it's very much still, and it's very important to bear in mind that nobody thinks, those who talk about autonomy don't talk about national independence. Yes, these are two very different things. Yeah? If you are actually talking about, as a social democrat, like a Latvian social democrat, about autonomy at 1900 in the Russian Empire, then you are rather thinking about democratic federalization of the Russian Empire, but you don't think about a Latvian nation state. And this is very important because I'm going to talk about this, and now we are shifting to the basically the 1917-1918 context, so the last minutes of the war, the Wilsonian moment, if you want, and the Leninian moment in another way, where actually these communities are starting to face the possibility of actually separation. And it's very interesting that although, again, the textbook and the local canonic narrative is that there is a linear development towards the nation state as the solution to all these problems, if you look really as an intellectual historian to the debates that these intellectuals are having, then it looks like that the nation state as a possibility is a very late and very, how to say, reluctantly undertaken alternative to the much more naturally considered alternative, which is some sort of federal solution. And I'm stressing this because, again, retrospectively, these options were kind of erased from collective memory. Now, here there are very interesting cases. I mean, like the story that I'm telling in the paper that I distributed is the Ukrainian case. It's very, very interesting that basically in 1917, 1918, the Ukrainian elite, I mean, here the most interesting case is a historian called Mihailo Khrushchevsky, who features, I think, also in both Stefan's perspectives in one way or another. I mean, he is all the time stressing that basically, you know, we should somehow still keep to some sort of democratic federation. And there are also very interesting Baltic cases, 1917, 1918, like even the person who is actually signing the independence declaration of Latvia is saying that actually this Latvian state is not to last for long. It's only lasting until in Russia the Bolsheviks fall and there will be again some sort of kind of democratic left-wing federal rule in Russia, and then Latvia will join again the Russian Federation. So it couldn't conceive, like social democrats in Latvia couldn't conceive that a country like Latvia can exist for long. Yes, I mean, like the idea was that we will actually upkeep this country until we get rid of the Bolsheviks and there will be a social democratic Russian state. And I think this is very, very telling. Interestingly, even in the 1920s, retrospectively, most of the Ukrainian left wing, this kind of socialist but not communist intellectuals, were kind of explaining very, very kind of vocally that that basically they didn't want. For a very long time, they didn't want a Ukrainian nation state. And I mean, to explain you why the nation state option didn't seem to be very convincing in many cases. I mean, just another example, even more precarious example than the Ukrainian case, the Belarusian case. I mean, if you just consider this sequence of events, which I put down in this text, that there is the Brest-Litovsk peace agreement, then a compromise between the different factions of the Belarusian movement to kind of think about some sort of emancipation from both the Germans and the Bolsheviks, then a Bolshevik occupation after the collapse of Imperial Germany, so this is December 1918, then a Polish occupation, then setting up an administration for trying to fit into the Polish multi-ethnic space, so Belarus could be some sort of part of a Polish multi-ethnic republic, then the return of the Red Army, 1920, then the Riga Treaty, which divides these territories between Soviets and Poland. Yes, so basically in 2 years you have 6 shifts of sovereignty in the same territory, and every time you have some intellectual groups and political factions who are trying to adjust to the new situation. But then what is, I think, constant in this story, I mean, of course, every time they are readjusting it completely the other way around, but what is constant in the story, I think, is that they all the time think that somehow Belarus in itself is not a viable entity, that there should be some sort of kind of coexistence with somebody. And it's not only because of the occupation, yes, it's also because it's inconceivable for most of these elites that an entity like a nation state in this context can function. Now, and then of course you have lots of other examples. I don't want to go into all the examples. I think my other favorite, to give you a Central European example, is the Czech example, which again is in the official narrative, like, you know, the Prophet Masaryk was foreseeing the independent Czechoslovakia from the very beginning. But if you look at the Czechoslovak or Czech and Slovak public sphere in 1970, 1980, not only because of the censorship, Austrian censorship, which was obviously there, but also in terms of how they could conceive of a kind of transformation of the state they were living in. Basically, the most likely option was that, and this is what, for example, Josef Pekář, the main Czech conservative historian and a very big kind of intellectual debate partner of Masaryk, was actually saying that even in 1980, in October, he was basically conceiving of some sort of trialist solution. Yes, that like basically separating Czech lands, or maybe even Czech and Slovak lands, from the Habsburg lands, Austrian lands, and Hungary, but then still keep a personal union. Yes, that there should be the Habsburg emperor will be crowned as a Czech king. Yes, that's the horizon of expectation. Nobody is conceiving of Czechoslovakia as really a viable alternative. Now, In the Yugoslav case, it's also very interesting. There you have basically a kind of very interesting division line between those who are conceiving of Yugoslavia as a kind of extension of the Serbian state, and this is mainly obviously the Serbian politicians, and then more or less all this Yugoslavist emigre community who is kind of thinking about Yugoslavia as some sort of multinational, multi-ethnic space. And again, the Habsburg Yugoslavs, so like Croats and Serbs living in the Habsburg monarchy, have a hard time to imagine what kind of framework they can join and what they cannot join. So they are kind of wavering between keeping up some sort of Yugoslav entity, which is part of the Habsburg monarchy, or kind of turn this Yugoslav entity into some sort of federal partner of the Serbians. But these are all very, very, very unclear for a very long time. Now, I think the next important thing is that when this self-determination discourse comes in, then it gives a tool to all these communities. So like when I'm talking about all these actors who are kind of trying to frame their national community, the self-determination becomes a language, definitely. But then it still remains very much a question of whose self is to be determined, yes? And I think here, for example, the example that I gave about these Yugoslavs in Habsburg Empire is a very interesting question, that they speak in the name of Yugoslavs, but then it's a question whether it's actually the Yugoslavs in Habsburg Empire or Yugoslavs in general, or does it include actually the Serbs who had a different statehood tradition? So there are lots of problems, and then of course it also raises the problem from the perspective of the new nation-state builders. For example, when Masaryk is actually finally really starting to build the Czechoslovak Republic, there is an obvious question, and I mean we didn't discuss too much about this, but I think this is one of the key issues, is that like where do you draw the line of who can determine himself, self or itself, and who cannot determine itself? Yeah, so which is the self that can be allowed to determine, self-determine? And I mean here, of course, in the Czechoslovak case, the main issue will be the Germans. That it's very nice that the Czechoslovak Republic is based on the principle of self-determination in the name of oppressed Czechs and Slovaks now freely deciding to create a Czechoslovak state. But why do you not allow the same self-determination to the Germans? And it's also very interesting that this is the context that creates, and I think this is also very crucial, that this is the context, this is the pressure, intellectual pressure, that creates, for example, the whole idea, there is quite a lot of research about this, of Sudeten German. Yeah? So like there was no such a community of Germans in Bohemia. Yes, I mean Germans in Bohemia had very different local identities, like mostly urban city identities, but there was not much understanding that everybody who is part of the future non-existent Bohemian or Czechoslovak state will have a common German identity of being Germans of a specific type. Yes, it's only in the context of this pressure coming from the self-determination principle that actually pushes these people to actually constitute an entity called Sudeten Germans. Yes, I mean, because that is exactly formatting. And that's very similar in other cases, for example, Transylvanian Hungarians. Yes, I mean, there was no such a category of Transylvanian Hungarians, or if there was such a category, it didn't include most of the people who after 1920 become part of Romania and start to identify themselves as Transylvanian Hungarians, even though historically they are not part of the Transylvanian land. So like nobody would call himself Transylvanian Hungarian in Arad or Oradea or Timisoara, which are places which are historically not part of Transylvania. But in the context of in this early 1920s context, all of them frame themselves into Transylvanian Hungarian identity, because this becomes the kind of self that can theoretically determine itself. Now, the other element about self-determination, I don't want to spend much time about it, but I think it's also important that it gets very interestingly connected with the question of state form. Yes, I mean, like we talked about self-determination only in terms of self-determination as a national self-determination, but it's also very important that we are talking about an outburst of liberal democratic discourses in the early 20s. This is again something that we tend to forget when we talk about the interwar period. We talk about the interwar period as a illiberal period usually, but if you look at the early 20s, there is this very strong liberal democratic moment. And of course, in that context, the question is that if we are actually implementing the self-determination principle, it also means that there is a kind of constitutive moment of choosing the state form. Yes, and then in some cases, for example, Radic, about whom yesterday Miguel was talking, he's actually putting the two things together. So actually agrarianism, republicanism, and national self-determination for the Croats is actually coming together into one discourse. And I could tell you other examples as well, Albanians, Estonians. I mean, sometimes it really becomes part of a Republican project. So you really have a Republican discourse. And sometimes it is kind of more diffuse. So I mean, it's republicanism, but not in a Republican state. Now, the second issue that I would like to talk about is the dynamics, very shortly, is the dynamics between centralism and anti-centralism, or how you can put together this dialectics. And I think here, I think one of the most important things is that there is a very strong, and here I would connect very much to what Stefan Berger was telling, this liberal nationalist public discourse is very important in terms of kind of framing the public sphere of the successor states. Yeah, so I mean, like, there is a kind of vision of how a nation state should look like, and it's very important that liberal nationalism at that point is extremely etatist. Yeah, so when we, again, this is contradictory to what we would normally expect, that when we talk about liberal nationalism in general terms, then we probably presume that this is kind of connected to classical liberalism in terms of its economic policies and in terms of its anthropology. But if you look at East Central European liberal nationalism, and I suspect that is very true for the Spanish story, and I think also other peripheral liberal nationalism, that liberal nationalism is extremely statist. And also, by the way, not about free trade at all. I mean, it's actually economically protectionist ideology, and that is very important, that you have a kind of project of creating basically modern states, which is according to this liberal nationalist script. But this liberal nationalist script is actually very reluctant to incorporate autonomies of any sort. It is about actually a nation-state building core, a center, which is imposing a modernizing narrative. So I mean, I would actually argue that this is a modernizing nationalism where the liberal elements are actually more and more disappearing. Now, here I think one of the most important things is that basically that explains why is it that nominally liberal politicians get so upset by the minority treaties provisions. Yes, I mean, like, the most important and most classical example, which I like the most, is the Romanian Prime Minister Brătianu, who is actually the flagship of this liberal nationalist tradition in basically the whole region, and in Romania in particular, who resigns as a protest against the minority treaties. So basically he says that I cannot run a country which is humiliated by the Western powers. And imagine that Romania is the biggest winner of the whole peace treaty construction. So like, it's not that he is a loser. He is not the Hungarian prime minister. He is not the Bulgarian prime minister. He is the triumphant prime minister who gets everything that the Romanian nation building ever wanted. And he still says that, you know, I'm humiliated. I cannot run this country anymore. So I think it's a very interesting and telling dynamics about what this project entailed. Now, I will not spend too much time on the kind of challenges coming from the European Congress of European Nationalities Congress, because I think that has been very nicely discussed. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that there are also local repercussions of this. So like you talked about more or less the transnational networking, but then it's very interesting how these kind of ideas are attempted to be employed in local negotiation. I mean, the example that I'm bringing here is, for example, the Slovenians in Italy. Yes, I mean, Wilfan we talked about, but then there are local figures as well who are trying to negotiate basically these kind of principles against the fascist state. and which would be, again, normally you would believe that this is hopeless, yes? I mean, like, why would they negotiate with the fascist state? But then there are very interesting intellectual projects to somehow try to sell to the Italian this kind of understanding of minority protection. For example, to try to convince the Italians that if you want to have a colonial empire, then you have to have a best practice. And we Slovenians can serve as a best practice for you. So if you treat us nicely, then it will be much easier to expand the fascist empire to other places as well. So kind of use us as a laboratory for generous nationality politics. And then this is actually something that is negotiated until some point, and then of course, I mean, they realize that this is not a realistic option, and then they withdraw, and mainly withdraw to Austria actually. Also, I think it's very important to bear in mind that contexts, the understanding of nation state and nationality state is to a certain extent left open and negotiated. I think a very good example where you can find it conceptually as well is Poland. In the early 20s, this is the story again Stefan Dyrov was mentioning about the constitution that they kind of accepted but then never implemented. I mean, there is an option in the Polish discussion to actually push towards some sort of multi-ethnic state. Yes, I mean, and this is of course connected to the fact that Polish political culture traditionally was connected to this idea of gentry republicanism, which was colorblind to a large extent. I mean, everybody could be part of the Polish nation if he was a nobleman, but it was not an ethnic identification. And the Polish left in the late 19th century, the Pilsudskian left, was actually somehow connecting its intellectual to this. It's interesting that the left was more gentry Republican and the right was much more democratic nationalist. Yeah, so it's also a kind of interesting contradiction that actually the late 19th century, early 20th century Polish right was populist, ethnic, nationalist, anti-Semitic right, was actually coming from a background for popular classes. Yes, I mean, it's of course similar to the Austrian new populist ethnic nationalism and the other similar cases. So it gave a kind of very interesting dynamics, and I think you probably know, or if you don't know, then you will be happy or unhappy to note that the first Polish president was killed basically in this debate. Yeah, so I mean, like he was elected by the votes of the non-Polish ethnic minority representatives in the Polish Sejm, and then they calculated that if only ethnic Poles voted in the election, in the presidential election, then the other candidate, the nationalist candidate, would have won. And then they basically this created a huge debate whether the non-Polish members of parliament had a right to vote a Polish president. And the right was telling that actually this is a Polish issue and you are tolerated, you have your rights, you are protected by international agreements, but you don't have the right to determine the future of the Polish nation. And the Polish president is a representative of the Polish nation, so please abstain from the votes. And when they didn't abstain and actually they voted the left-wing agrarian, by the way, candidate, then artist, a little bit crazy artist, shot the president. So this was the end of the story actually, and that he was after like 1 week after he was sworn in. I think another very important community where you can test these ambiguities very nicely, and we talked about them, but I think it would even require more multi-layered analysis, is of course the Jewish story, yes, because I mean they are not fitting into the territorialized logic, and that's why basically it created a lot of very complex intellectual thinking of whether they fit in, whether they don't fit in, and also, of course, also in the Jewish discussion inside you could get a plurality of opinions. And I think here I would like to stress that every context, every national context in Eastern Europe has a different dynamics. Yeah, so I mean, like basically you cannot just say that there is a division between Zionists and non-Zionists. Yes, I mean, even Zionists could have very different vision in different contexts. Sometimes Zionists could actually have a clearly a kind of vision about the Aliyah, like basically helping people to leave the country. In other cases, they said that, well, in the distant future, we might actually leave for Palestine, but for the next couple of decades or centuries, we are more interested in actually building a viable nationality culture in the territory of the country where we live, yes? And then also the people who are actually criticizing the Zionists Zionists could also have very complex identity projects and connected actually to self-determination, but in a very different way. For example, Orthodox who were actually saying that religious identity is more important than ethnic identity. So basically, they were willing to make coalition with conservative parties, conservative majority parties, on the basis of exactly against the Zionists, saying that it's more important for us to kind of protect our religious rights than our national rights. We don't want language rights, we want actually religious rights. And then, of course, also you have all kind of secular leftist Jewish groups who were actually attacking the Zionists for trying to kind of create a nation state. But then these left-wing Jewish groups could also claim to represent Jewish nationality, yes? And then again, in different contexts, Zionists would tend to be more interested in Hebrew, reviving of Hebrew culture, but then in many other contexts you would have actually a revival of Yiddish culture, and that's also a very interesting dynamics. But then you can also find Zionists who are actually interested in Yiddish culture, which would not normally not be meaningful project, but in the local context in some places it was meaningful. Now, as for the debate between centralists and federalists, I think like it's very important also to bear in mind that these categories are also shifting. So it means different to be a centralist in the early 20s. It means very different to be centralist in the early 30s. And the same people could shift all the time as well. And also the horizons of expectation could be very different. So people could say that we are accepting unitarism, but we are also interested in somehow preserving the multiplicity of the national plurality of our country. For example, in the case of Yugoslavia, so people could accept Serbian dominance, but still say that, you know, in exchange, please sustain still some sort of cultural plurality. And you could also have federalist projects which were not culturalist, yes, which could say that we want federalization, but the basis of federalization is not the traditional national entities. The self-determination is not about returning to the national cleavages or tribal cleavages that has existed before 1918, but we want actually federalization in the sense, and we also talked, I think, a little bit about this, on the basis of, let's say, self-governing entities, irrespective of their national belonging. And I think in the Czechoslovak case also it's very, very interesting if you are kind of following all the plurality of positions, that of course normally you would presume that there is a Czech centralist and the Slovak autonomist position, but it's also shifting very interestingly. Like the same Slovaks in the early 20s didn't believe that Slovak entity can exist. Yeah, so I mean they were so much afraid of Hungarians basically that they couldn't imagine that if Slovaks would withdraw from a Czechoslovak state, they would have a chance. They were kind of considering that immediately the Hungarians would take these territories. So they are very wary about claiming self-determination for the Slovaks. But then in the 1930s, of course, in a very different context with the rise of a new Catholic elite and the kind of actual nation building imposed by the Czechoslovakist authorities who create a new Slovak elite in Bratislava, in the university and everything, there is a sustainable group of, let's say, local intellectual class and middle class who are already imagining a Slovak nation state. And the irony is that many of the guys who will become the leadership of the Slovak fascist or collaborationist state are actually raised by the Czechoslovakist educational system, who are actually trying to create a Czechoslovak elite in Bratislava. Now, I think the last thing I would like to mention is basically about projects of regional challenges, regionalist challenges to this kind of homogenizing nation state model. I think here it's important that there are two kinds of regionalism. Yes, I think we talked also about this to a certain extent. One would be the supranational regionalism, and the other one would be the subnational regionalism. Yes, and of course sometimes the interesting thing is that the two can even overlap. I mean, like you can create regional entities that are smaller and bigger than the nation state at the same time. So it cuts out some parts of the nation state, but it bridges nation states. But I would still say that analytically the two categories can be to a certain extent still separated. I mean, a good example for the first one would be, for example, Balkan federalism. That is very, very much present in the interwar period. I mean, like, again, the left definitely, and especially the guys sitting in Moscow for a long time, like Dimitrov and company, they are very much considering federalism as so the whole leftist social democratic and communist tradition is very much federalist. Of course, the long-term outcome of this pan-Balkan federalism will be Yugoslavia in 1945. But, ironically, the original federalist project was promoted by the Bulgarians, who were trying to solve the problem of Macedonia. Yes, so like the question was that Macedonia cannot be solved. Macedonian problem cannot be solved in any nation state framework, because to whomever you give them, there will be a conflict. If you give them to the Yugoslavs, then the Greeks and the Bulgarians are upset. If you give them to the Greeks, then the Bulgarians and the Serbs are upset. So the only way to kind of solve the problem of Macedonia is to create a Balkan Federation where Macedonia can be an entity in itself. Yes, and that is basically the discussion that is going on in the 1920s in the Comintern, sitting in Moscow, and Dimitrov and company, they are actually theorizing federalism in order to solve these kind of problems. But there are also, of course, Central European federalist traditions, which are relatively well documented, both in the early phase, so like 1918, Oskar Jászai, who is in the last moment of the First World War, still tries to transform the Habsburg Empire into some sort of federalism, and also in the late 20s, early 30s, there is a kind of economic federalism, which is not so much thinking about the state transformation. Like, they're not saying that, you know, we should kind of blow up the nation state as a thing, because they are kind of seeing that nation states are there already, but they are hoping that somehow a socio-economic framework kind of could restore the cooperation of these nations, more or less a kind of like depoliticized Habsburg monarchy. And there are also quite interesting figures around this discussion. There is quite a lot of research now also about them. And then also with the subnational federalism, there are also very interesting sorry for the supranational, one more good example, which is a funny example. Again, it's completely forgotten now, but it's very telling about the way people were thinking. Balto-Scandian Federation, for example. Yes, there's a huge debate that the Baltic countries cannot exist as independent countries. That's excluded, but they should kind of reconfigure themselves into a kind of broader space together with the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians. And there is a kind of vision that there could be a kind of new power center of Europe, kind of Nordic power center of Europe. It's promoted by some of the Lithuanian intellectuals, some of the Estonian intellectuals, and it's actually well received by some of the Finnish and Swedish intellectual elites. I think Swedish conservatives and Finnish social democrats are actually very much receptive to this. And the last thing is about the subnational federalism. Again, these are projects that almost none of them ever worked out, so it's very hard to point at best practice. But if you look at how much debate was about it in the interwar period, and it shows that people were very much invested into this kind of question. Very good example, for example, I already mentioned Transylvanian discourse. You have a Romanian Transylvanian discourse in the 1920s, which is saying that basically Romanian nation state is centralist, it destroys the local specificities, and it basically destroys the local elites that were much more kind of westernized than the center. Yes, so basically this is a kind of argument of people who subjects to the Habsburg monarchy and who are resenting the kind of Balkanic invasion of Romanian state bureaucracy coming from Bucharest. And they are using this Transylvanian federalist discourse to kind of position themselves against the centralist homogenizing project. And you can also find very similar discourse from the Hungarians, who are saying that, you know, we are neither Hungarians from Hungary, we are not Romanians, obviously, Transylvanian Hungarians, and the Transylvanian Hungarians and the Transylvanian Romanians are much more connected to each other than any of them to their possible kin state. So the Transylvanian Romanian is closer to a Transylvanian Hungarian than to a Romanian from Bucharest. And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of quite interesting literature coming from this, also visual culture and stuff like that. So there's even a kind of post-Art Nouveau or Art Deco visual style which emerges as a Transylvanist visual project. The only problem is that the two groups never talk to each other. Yeah? So like basically the Romanian Transylvanists are still saying that you have to give us more independence from the center in order to protect the Romanians' interest from the bloody Hungarians, whereas the Hungarians are ultimately saying that of course we are very similar to the Romanians in Transylvania, but basically we are challenged by them as well, so maybe we can make a deal with Bucharest. So actually it never works out into a common front. But it's very interesting that semantically the discourse is very similar, but they never actually meet in political. I mean, usually they are on two sides of the political barricade and not on the same side. But again, if you look at, for example, after '89, there are very interesting repercussions of this. I mean, some sort of anti-communist electoral culture in Transylvania in the 1990s, so kind of liberal, right liberal coalitions in Transylvania in the 1990s. Also very similar story in Vojvodina against Milosevic in the 1990s. So some of these pockets of regionalism actually, with all the problems and all the ethnic conflicts, actually survived the communist period or sometimes even reinforced in the communist period, like in the case of Vojvodina, and could come back in the 1990s. So I would say that the real political weight of these discourses is not just the actual unsuccessfulness of them in the interwar period, but very often the longue durée impact on the political culture of these countries. And there I think that we can be, of course, reasonably pessimistic about any intellectual activity in general, but still there are some kind of indications that some of these more tolerant, more incorporative discourses, which were trying to kind of go against the logic of the nation state, were not so hopeless as they look when we only look the macro diplomatic history of the region, where of course no place for any of these intellectuals. So I would still say that it makes sense to discuss things even if you can't implement them politically immediately. And this is, I think, my moderately optimistic final word. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So, Kosovo is my only word in Hungarian. Kosovo Valax for this very interesting overview. I mean, the losers have also place in history.
Exactly.